Hi guys, it's Phil here. Today I'm going to talk about something that people have asked me to make a video about, which is about self-esteem. Self-esteem is so important. There's great research on the importance of self-esteem in terms of how happy we are, in terms of how that affects our health. And what's interesting about self-esteem is we are the only ones who are really in charge of it. So if somebody says to you, if your self-esteem is low, and somebody says, you should feel really good about yourself, you don't. Equally, if your self-esteem is high and somebody says, you really shouldn't feel too good about yourself, that doesn't really bother you either. So the only true measure, any person who's fully equipped to judge your self-esteem is you. And therefore it is something that we have more power over than we might imagine. So let's talk a little bit about what self-esteem is. So self-esteem is something around the idea of I feel competent to do what I'm trying to do. I feel that I'm able to do the things I want to do in life. The opposite, low self-esteem, is just doubting yourself, doubting your ability to be happy, to be in relationships, to be successful, whatever it is. The other thing to think about self-esteem is, or self-worth, is it's not something that we're born with, and issues around self-worth. If you were able to talk to a tiny baby of 2 months old and you were able to communicate to them and say, so what's your self-worth like? It really wouldn't show up for them as a question. And this is another interesting thing about self-esteem. People who don't have self-esteem issues never really think about it. If you ever meet someone who's got, a high self-worth, thinks about themselves in a positive way, you say, what's your self-esteem like? They usually go, don't know. It's not something that shows up for me. People who talk about self-esteem a lot tend to be people who have noticed that it's not the way they want it to be, which also tells you that they notice that they want it to be different. And that tells them also that they know there's the possibility it can be different. Come back to our 2-month-old baby. When the 2-month-old baby wakes up in the middle of the night and decides they want something, they don't go, it's a little bit early. My needs are probably not as important as anybody else because, I don't really deserve good things. Maybe I shouldn't scream. That's clearly not what happens. When little babies wake up, they scream. Why do they do that? Because they want something and they feel that is, they are deserving of it and it should be provided. So we can look at little babies, almost universally, they do that. And that tells us that we start off with quite a high sense of self-esteem, that, we think the world should be looking after us. And that also tells us, of course, if somebody has issues with low self-esteem, this is a learnt behavior. This is not who you are, although that's often how we describe it. We'll say, I am someone with low self-esteem. We'd say, no, this is something that's just a learnt behavior. You probably learnt it a number of times. It's something that's been taught to you. Somebody has told you that. So if you see a little kid, again, drawing a picture, they'll often rush up and go, hey, I've drawn this picture. Why do they do that? Because they're excited about it. They're not showing off. They're just excited about it and want to share that with the world. But it doesn't take too many times of somebody saying, oh, it's a dreadful picture, take that away, stop annoying me, for them to retreat from that confidence in themselves that they've got something that somebody might be interested in having a look at. So already we've recognised that self-esteem, high self-esteem, good self-esteem, is something that we're born with, pretty much universally. And if we don't have it, it's because we've learned not to have it. So it's kind of where we began. And all that's happened is we've learnt not to have it, to doubt it, not to trust ourselves. And the self-esteem is really the same as having confidence in our ability to do something. And having recognised this, it starts to show us some ways that we can maybe change how we feel about ourselves. First thing is really recognising this is not who you are. This is something that you've just done a lot of the time. So self-esteem is one of your issues. It's just as a result of practice. And if you've watched any of my other videos, I almost invariably talk about neuroplasticity. The more you use a particular pathway, the stronger and more influential it becomes on the way your brain works. So if you keep on telling yourself, I'm no good at this, I'm a bit rubbish, I don't deserve good stuff, then that starts to build those pathways. Not very empowering pathways, but the more you build them, the stronger they become. And of course, as they become strong, that affects your actions and your behaviors and the way that you form relationships, the jobs that you go for, how you talk to yourself, how you talk about yourself to other people, where you go socially, where you don't go, who you ask out on dates, who you don't, all that stuff. And so as a result, we start to build the neurology of how we feel about ourselves, which then builds the world around us. And a bit like, when people date, they often will think, well, I'm about this attractive, I'll go for someone about the same. They won't go for the supermodel, or they won't go for somebody they think is below them in terms of what they could get. And self-esteem's the same. As most things, going for jobs and stuff, people only generally go for jobs they think they've got a chance of getting. They don't go for, a CEO job if they've only ever been a T-boy, mostly. So we build a world that kind of reflects how we feel about ourselves. And then sometimes you stumble across people who have high self-esteem, and you notice an interesting thing. When you're with people who have high self-esteem, sometimes people with low self-esteem, or people who do low self-esteem, can feel further disempowered by that, particularly if the person is being very arrogant, which is not actually the same as self-esteem. That's just being arrogant. We'll come to that in a minute. But sometimes when you do stumble across people who have high self-esteem, you suddenly realize how nice it is to be around people who are supportive, because people who have high self-esteem have no agenda in knocking you down. They just want to be there and enjoy your company. What's interesting is people who try and knock you down, knock your own confidence. The only reason they do that is because they don't have very high self-esteem themselves. That's what drives it. People who have great self-esteem have no interest in trying to show how good they are compared to you by pushing you down. In fact, what they want to do is to encourage you to flourish and blossom in the way that they've managed to do. So if you notice people in your life who are doing you down, being negative towards you, who seem to be knocking your self-esteem, then be nice to them, be kind to them, because their self-esteem is probably even more bad than yours is. And don't take it personally. That's just their stuff. And the key thing that I often talk about on these videos is we really need to distinguish what is ours and what is someone else's. So again, with kids, a lot of the conversations that we learn about our self-esteem will be what our parents think. So if our parents have a thing about, talking about what you're good at is showing off, and that's very arrogant, and no good will come of that, then when a child goes, oh, mummy, I've done this nice thing, sometimes the mum will want to teach them that lesson about not being too effusive about their and celebrating their successes, and might say, it's okay, darling, but don't talk about it too much. And then we learn, well, why is that? Why do we not want to talk about the things we're good at? Well, because it's a sign that somebody who's not very thoughtful, somebody who isn't, really thinking about others, a sign of being selfish and being self-aggrandizing. Oh, I didn't realize that. And this is where we learn these kind of things. And that's not because our mums and dads want us to not have high self-esteem. It's because they don't want us to put ourselves in situations where we are exposed to ridicule by being, over exaggerating what we've achieved. But often those messages are quite nuanced, and we don't get it as kids. We just think, oh, it's bad to talk about things that you're good at. So we learn about self-esteem from so many other people, and very often it's their stuff, it's their worries, it's their concerns. And if you meet somebody who seems to spend a lot of time undermining other people, it's an almost invariable sign that self-esteem is an issue for them. So then the next question, of course, is, okay, so how do we change self-esteem? There's a new idea coming out at the moment from positive psychology, which is quite interesting, which is they're thinking about replacing the word self-esteem with self-compassion. Like being kind to yourself. And if any of you have ever done the lightning process, you'll know what the core things about the lightning process is about how do you develop a self-compassionate relationship to yourself? How do you start to be nice to yourself? In Buddhist teaching, there's a whole thing about the importance of compassion. And particularly, it says, if you want to be compassionate, first thing you need to do is start to be compassionate to yourself. And certainly in many other religious teachings, I always get told off for talking about Buddhism more than any other religion. Not because I'm a Buddhist, I just find it quite compatible with the stuff that I learn. But certainly in Christian teachings, that classic thing that Jesus said, which of all the biblical laws are the most important? He said, love God above all others, and secondly, love thy neighbour as thyself. And love thy neighbour as thyself is a lovely thing. It means, be nice to people. Treat other people as you would like to be treated. But also there's this second message in that very simple statement, which is love your neighbour as yourself. Doesn't mean be nasty to your neighbour so you can be nasty to yourself. It means clearly be nice to your neighbour so you have to be nice to yourself. You have to do it both ways, be nice to yourself and be nice to others. So we see in many, many spiritual and philosophical teachings this idea that being compassionate, being kind to ourselves is so important. And the other phrase that we often use in my work is, if you treated your friends like you treat yourself, would you have any? So if you said some of the stuff that you say to yourself to people out there, how would that go down? Some of the conversations we have with ourselves, you're fat, you're an idiot, what's the matter with you? Really undermining and demeaning. We wouldn't dream of saying that to anybody else. So maybe we should start catching ourselves in those very familiar, habitual, neuroplastic conversations that just go on and on about how rubbish we are. So first thing to do, as with all this stuff, is to be aware. It's to start to become aware. What are you doing? What conversations are you feeding yourself? What beliefs are you engendering about you? And then ask yourself, right, is that really how I want to be? Not, have I done this a lot? That's not a relevant question. Chances are the answer is yes. The question is this working for me? Is this moving my life in the way that I want it to? In the lightning process, we talk about this concept of the life you love. In positive psychology, they talk about it in terms of flourishing. Are you flourishing? Are these conversations bringing you to a life you love, to a place of flourishing? Because when you have a life you love, when you're flourishing, then not only do you feel better, but you become a much more valued asset to humankind, to the planet, because you can actually put your energy into things that you're passionate about without kind of hiding, staying at home, undermining yourself. You can just get on with doing stuff. So start to be aware of the conversations you're having with yourself. What kind of conversations are you having with yourself? And then just check in with them and ask yourself, is this useful? Not, is it right or is it wrong? Don't ask that question. Ask, is this useful? Is this moving me forwards in my life? If it isn't, then what you need to do is start to replace that conversation with something else. Replace those beliefs with something else. Now that's slightly beyond the scope of this video. If you've done the lightning process, you'll have some tools from that. If you've done other practices, I'm sure you'll have some tools from that. The first thing is just to recognize this is not who you are. This is just something you've got very, very used to doing because you've been taught it. And if you've been taught it, you can unlearn it and learn something else. So ask yourself, well, what would I like to learn about myself? And what would I like to train myself into thinking about myself? And have that as be your mission for the next few months and see what happens as a result. And I guess the final thing is, there's a double bind that people can get into where they're like, yeah, but why should I put any time into me? I'm not that important. And that will, of course, keep you stuck. Instead, just really challenge that and say, well, I am important. I am important enough. It doesn't mean to say, in the hierarchy of things, I'm the most important person in the world. It's not saying that, but it's saying I am as important as anybody else. Carl Rogers, the very famous humanist psychotherapist, said he was doing some work in front of a group of people explaining what he did with a client. The client came in, he said, I'm just going to introduce myself to them. And he kind of told them, the group who were watching, what he was doing. And he suddenly realized, I just realized something. There's something I do before I see any client. So the first thing I do is I say to myself, Carl, you don't know everything, but you are enough. What I bring here is enough to try and find a way to help this person. I don't know everything, but I am enough. So start to ask yourself, am I telling myself I am enough? Or are you doing this, when I've done this, then I can? Start to really recognize that you are already enough. See you guys later. Bye.